Thanks for joining us. I'm Helen Jung. I'm the opinion editor with the Oregonian. Laura Gunderson with the editorial board is also with us. And we're talking today with the Democratic candidates for House District 46. I'm going to start out by asking both of you to give just a 1 or 2 minute introduction about why you're running for this position and why you think you're the best person for this. Let's start off in alphabetical order. So Jeff, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Okay, I have a proven track record of leadership in the private sector and in the government and in nonprofit leadership. I ran Impact Northwest for 5 years, and when I ran it, it was a struggling nonprofit when I took it over, and when I left it, it was a thriving nonprofit. Little more than 3 years ago, I had a stroke, and I couldn't speak at all after my stroke. But my nonprofit provided me short-term and long-term disability insurance for a year of speech therapy, and I got better. But you shouldn't have to have that be necessary to get you better from a health crisis. I think that we have to have all Oregonians have adequate health care. And in the interim, when we've been running, the coronavirus crisis has occurred. And I have a lot of leadership at the county and at the nonprofit that says that I could lead the state with this record.
Great, thank you very much. Khanh, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Pham, and I am a working mom of a 5-year-old daughter who's going to start Portland Public Schools this September. I am the daughter of Vietnamese refugees. I'm the wife of an immigrant, and I've been living and working in House District 46 for many years now. First, I was working at the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon as a manager of immigrant organizing, and now I'm at Opal Environmental Justice Oregon. Most recently, I helped to build the most diverse coalition the city's ever seen to pass the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is raising $50 million a year, particularly now at a time when we need it most. It's going to be offering $50 million a year for renewable energy, energy efficiency jobs, and job training. I'm running because after we built this powerful coalition that united neighborhood associations, small businesses, communities of color, this coalition wanted to take this vision to the state capitol. So they asked me to run to represent this vision and also to represent the communities that don't have a voice right now. Our district includes the Jade District, which has one of the highest concentrations of Asians and Pacific Islanders in the state, and yet we've never had an Asian American representative. And so I'm running to make sure that our voices, our leadership, and our vision is represented in Salem.
Great, thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of alternate between you two in terms of who goes first on answering questions. So Khanh, you'll be first on this one. It's unknown just how much the pandemic and the stay-home order will cost the state in terms of tax revenue, as well as how long and how deep the economic impacts will cut. Can you give a couple ideas of what you think the legislature should do next to help individuals and businesses get through this economic crisis?
Absolutely. It is important to recognize this COVID crisis is going to be catastrophic. We are going to have to make tough choices, and this recession is going to be much worse than we faced in 2008. But I'm prepared to make those tough choices. And I think that as a legislature, we need to take a comprehensive look at our state's revenue system to find out where can we close some of the loopholes, particularly for corporations that used to pay 18.5% of our state's budget in 1975. And almost a third of that, they just make up 6.7% as recently as 2019, last year. And so that's severely impacted our ability to have a healthcare system in the midst of this crisis, a fully funded healthcare system as well as education system. So I think we need to look at revenue reform and make sure that we're, at this time now more than ever, investing in the needed social services that right now families who are losing their jobs and losing access to healthcare are going to depend on more than ever.
Okay. And Jeff, for you, the question is just, it's unknown how hard the pandemic and the stay-home order will hurt Oregon's tax revenue. Sorry, this is my third one today, so I'm a little bit rummy. Can you give a couple ideas of what you think the legislature should do next to help individuals and businesses get through this economic crisis?
Well, they should cut their spending. I managed Multnomah County during the last Great Recession, and we cut budgets for all 4 years, but we didn't cut programs. We cut budgets because we cut, administrative efficiencies. We gave 0% COLAs for a couple years. We went from Microsoft to Google, and that saved $1 million a year. And so we should do that first. But I think that that's not going to be enough. And so we should do revenue second. And that's, I have a couple of ideas for revenue. We have a capital gains tax that's lower than the income tax, and we have to raise it to the income tax level. And that's going to generate several $100 million a year. We have people who have homes get to deduct all of the homes. But I think we should just have one home they can deduct, and that's going to save us like $50 million a year. And so we can do that second.
And so that's like the mortgage interest deduction that you're talking about, like for
Yes.
second homes versus first.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I would like to actually kind of delve a little bit more into the revenue side of the picture. Jeff, you just mentioned a couple of things that you would look to. Is there any other kind of significant tax reform or revenue system changes that you think the state should be looking at?
Well, if we do those first two things and we still don't have enough revenue, I think we should look at a sales tax for the state. And I think that's something that we really should look at.
And Khanh, how about you? In terms of the revenue picture, you talked about closing loopholes. Are there specific measures that you would take or specific changes that you would champion to make sure either that there's increased business taxes, business tax revenue, or other changes to the system?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important to note that Oregon already does tax capital gains at the same rate as personal income. You might be confusing it with the federal tax system, which does treat capital gains and income tax differently, but the Oregonian itself recently reported about the capital gains tax structure in Oregon, which is the same rate for both. But I would say for tax, as I mentioned, the Oregon Center for Public Policy recently did a study, and they found that we could raise $375 million if we close the loopholes for corporations being able to for offshore, having their taxes be placed in offshore accounts. And if we could close that, $375 million would be raised. And that's one of the examples of how I think we need to take to close the tax breaks that corporations are currently taking advantage of. And they're taking advantage of it by the lack of campaign finance reform. They're paying off our legislators rather than paying their taxes.
And is a state sales tax something that you would be interested in looking at?
I'd be open to exploring it, but yeah, I'd want to see more of the studies, but absolutely.
Okay. Let's see, Khanh, if you can go first on this one. Even with federal assistance, Oregon's needs will far outstrip the revenue it brings in. And while we did just talk about some potential ways to raise revenue, there still is a question about how the legislature should go about building its next budget. What philosophy or concepts would guide you in what you would support funding, and also what you would support either cutting or holding back on?
Yeah, my philosophy is that budgets are moral documents, and that we have to reflect our state's values in our budgets. So I think that in making decisions about our state's budget, I want to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable Oregonians, struggling families who depend on access to housing services, to food and healthcare services that our state provides. That's the value system, and that's the lens with which I would make decisions as I approach the very difficult cuts that we're going to have to make as a state.
Great. Jeff, same question for you. Even with federal assistance, Oregon's needs will far outstrip its revenue. What are the ideas or philosophy that would guide you in terms of helping the legislature craft a new budget?
Well, I think that budgets are a moral document, and I think that we should provide support for our low-income people and for people in poverty, but we should not provide support for prisons, because those are, I think that there's been, the war on drugs is a bad thing, and people in prison are overwhelmingly associated with the war on drugs. And so we should evaluate that and get rid of the people who've been in prison for the war on drugs.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Laura, do you want to, sorry, Laura has a question I know about PERS that I think is appropriate to jump into now.
Yeah, I think so. And I should direct this at, I'm horrible at keeping track of whose turn it
Jeff
is to go
first.
first.
Yeah.
Jeff, okay, thank you. Analysts warn that the legislature's decision to delay repayment of the pension system's $25 billion unfunded liability would put the fund at greater risk in the event of a recession. Well, here we are. Stocks have plummeted, and we're almost certainly in a recession now. What, if anything, do you think we should do to tackle this public finance crisis?
Well, I think that if the unfunded liability in PERS goes up significantly, I think that we should have a conversation as a state, and we should have a ballot measure with a bond that fully funds or partially funds PERS.
And Khanh, would you like the question repeated?
No, I think I got it. I think it's, yeah, the PERS liability is a massive debt, as you mentioned, over $25 billion, and it needs to be addressed. We need to stop kicking the can down the road. And it's, we've seen the impacts on not just the state, but also our local jurisdictions who have to also shoulder this burden. I think, again, we have to look at our revenue system to make sure that we are making corporations who have played a shrinking role to make sure that we can address this debt burden. It is the last cuts have made it more self-sustaining as a system, and I actually agree with what Jeff's saying that we do need to figure out a way to pay off this debt in a way that isn't on the backs of the working state employees whose system is now more or less self-sustaining.
Would you make any changes in benefits going forward?
No, like I said, I think like Jeff, I think that we need to figure out a way to fund and pay back this debt. But I don't think it makes sense to change the current benefits that employees are, the current system, tier 3 and beyond are paying into already, given that they've already made cuts.
Well, and just to clarify for both of you, so when you're talking about a potential ballot measure, are you thinking this would be something that Oregon voters would then pay for?
Yes.
So again, in the midst of a recession, when lots of households are already being, are having to pay more, you think this is Oregonians' responsibility to cover all of it?
I think that we should evaluate whether it's necessary, but I think that we should address it with the Oregonians, and if it becomes necessary, we should put a bond. That doesn't mean a bond like in November. Maybe it's a bond 2 years after November, but I think that we should do a bond.
And Jeff, also, did you, I didn't directly ask you this, but would you look to make any changes to benefits going forward?
No.
Great. Thank you. And I lost track, but I think Khanh goes first on this one. And it's interesting because if I remember correctly from your questionnaire, Khanh, you did not support the cap and trade plan that was moving through the legislature last year. Can you talk a little bit about that, but also, what you would you support some kind of climate change legislation in 2021?
I absolutely would support some kind of climate change legislation in 2021. My opposition to cap and trade didn't come from opposition to climate action, but I am firmly committed to actually making sure that what legislation we do pass is meeting the goals, the purported goals, which is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And after deeply analyzing and researching the experiences of other states, most primarily California, but as well as states in the Northeast who've done a modified version with the RGGI system, I've seen that the cap and trade has not been an effective mechanism to reduce emissions. And there have been other mechanisms that California has employed that have been much more effective that we need to explore. But the creation of a pollution trading market we can see now that the price is near rock bottom. It hasn't motivated industries to change their behavior. They've just been able to pay a minimal amount and incorporate it into pass the cost off to consumers, while also concentrating pollution in low-income Black and Brown communities that are around the refineries. We've seen that oil and gas emissions in California have actually increased under the cap and trade system. And so those are the reasons that I opposed it, not most primarily because it's not effective, and also it precludes, in my analysis, it precludes us from being able to take genuine climate action, because legislators can just say, oh, we've already taken climate action, we don't need to do anything. Polluters will say, oh, we've already taken action. And in this moment, when we have 10 years to make drastic cuts in our greenhouse gas emissions, we actually need to make sure that we're not just passing symbolic legislation that allows us to have a win. It has to be genuine. And that's what led me to publicly oppose the cap and the number one top priority of my party.
So what are some of the ideas, or what would you favor moving forward as opposed to cap and trade?
Well, I think we need to take a multi-pronged approach. I think addressing the transition to 100% renewable energy is really key, making sure that it's community controlled and there's local benefits to the projects, but we can do that by passing a renewable portfolio standard. Right now, our standard just says that we need to cut emissions by 50% by 2040, but it just stops there. And we're seeing other states go all the way to 100% renewables by 2050. And Oregon can take the lead in passing a 100% renewable portfolio standard. We can also address the Highway Trust Fund, which is over $600 million that is locked into building more highways and bridges. That it is a constitutional amendment, but the legislature can refer that to the ballot. And we need to, I would say transportation justice, regenerative agriculture, looking at our forestry techniques, and the transition to 100% renewable energy are some of my top priorities.
Okay. And Jeff, in terms of cap and trade, first of all, I guess, can you tell me just what your position was on the cap and trade legislation that was under consideration earlier this year, as well as if you would support that or alternate climate change legislation in 2021?
I support that, and I would support it in 2021, but we have to know that's just the beginning. I support 100% clean renewable energy. That's the next stage, but the cap and trade is the first step.
And, one obvious problem was that a number of Republican legislators, they said on behalf of their constituents were not in favor of this and walked out of the Senate and the House this past session. What would you do, or I guess, how would you address their concerns so that you don't have a situation where people are walking out of the legislature to stop its passage?
I would go meet with them and see whether we can come up with something. I'll meet with them in their districts, and I'll meet with them and people who are voters and constituents, and I'll see if we can come up with something. And if we can, I'll put that up first. But if we can't, I'll put cap and trade up first, and the next thing we'll do is 100% renewable energy.
And so kind of the idea being that you would, if there's something that you think is reasonable, you would support that, but otherwise you would just kind of proceed as planned.
Yes.
Okay. And Khanh, how about you? Same question, I guess. How would you respond to concerns by rural Oregonians and others that this is going to put them out of business?
I'm sorry, you cut off a bit, but I'm hearing that how would I work across the aisle to make sure that Oregonians across the state see the benefits of climate action? I think that, you know, we need to have conversations outside of our Portland bubble. As an organizer, I'm actually currently organizing a statewide listening tour to talk about the importance of taking climate action, but also talking about the real economic challenges facing communities across the state. So it's an Oregon Green New Deal listening tour, and we are turning it potentially virtual now, but as we envisioned it, we are traveling to Smith County and traveling to Goose Bay and Medford to talk with communities very different from our own, to find out what are the shared challenges that our communities face. Because I know from the conversations I've had that people are struggling from historic disinvestment, and they could use the investment dollars that the transition to a renewable economy can provide. So I see this as an incredible opportunity for communities, for rural communities, that have been left out of our economic growth, to be able to access jobs and investments. So those are the kinds of conversations that I'm already planning to have across the state, and will continue to have as a state legislator.
Great, and if you can go first on this one. Oregon's educational system has been known for years for having a low graduation rate and high chronic absenteeism. It's had limited success in closing the achievement gap between historically underserved students and white students. Recognizing that education funding is in doubt due to the pandemic, what other suggestions or ideas do you have to help close the achievement gap and improve the prospects of Oregon students?
So given the pandemic and the decrease in funding, I think there's other strategies we can take. I think in particular, as you mentioned, there is an achievement gap, and what I like to call an opportunity gap, right, between white families as well as and minority students. I think that we need to recruit more students that reflect the diversity of our public school system, and we can do that through the Portland Teachers Program is one example of the ways in which we've been able to recruit teachers. And we need to, as well as invest in programs that can, like dual language immersion programs that have been shown to close the achievement gap between students who come in speaking another language and native English speakers. Those are two ideas that I would offer.
Okay, and Jeff, same question for you in terms of the educational system. What ideas could you offer for helping to close the achievement gap and improve outcomes?
Well, Portland Public Schools has a pretty good record in recent years of closing the achievement gap, and I think that the state should look at that record, and they should recruit teachers who are not like who are like the students as opposed to not like the students, and they should do something, you know, in addition to that. But that's where they should look to first, Portland Public Schools.
I'm curious, actually, in what area has Portland Public Schools shined in terms of closing the equity gap? I'm just curious specifically what you're talking about.
Well, I read in the Oregonian that they had shined in closing the achievement gap, but it was particularly with teachers of color as opposed to white teachers in schools. That's what I read. Okay.
Let's see. I think, Laura, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, I had one. You mean on the generally?
Yeah.
And can you hear me? Because it seemed like maybe people are having trouble hearing.
It's a little staticky at times, but I think it's okay though.
All right. Sorry, I'm coming to y'all from Estacada, so it gets bad out here. So Jeff, my question was for you. You made some poor choices with a county employee when you were Multnomah County Chair, and you were not entirely upfront when the relationship became public. And the aftermath of your actions caused turmoil for the county. What did you learn from that, and why should voters today trust your judgment?
Well, we've all done things in our lives which we regret. And I've apologized and received acceptance of my apology from the people who I value most, my wife and my kids. But the best we can do is to view our mistakes and learn from those. And voters know they can trust me because at no time in the county and in no time in my large nonprofit did I serve in leadership I served in leadership with a compassion for vulnerable people, and that's what I'll do forward. I'll be compassionate for vulnerable people and all Oregonians.
Great, thank you. I think that pretty much covers the questions that we have. If you like, you can take about a minute to just kind of give some closing thoughts in terms of, again, why voters should choose you over your opponents. But let's see, I think Jeff went first. Why don't you go first, and then Khanh can have the last word.
Okay. When I served at the county, we were in the middle of the Great Recession. And I served at the county, and we cut programs for 4 years, but we cut budgets for 4 years, but we maintained programs. In fact, I added to Sun Schools for each of those 4 years. And if you elect me, I will take that as a state legislature and bring that to Salem. And that's why you should elect me.
Great, thank you. And Khanh, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm running to take money out of politics, the big money out of politics, and also to make sure that our communities in this time of really tough choices, that our communities have someone who's going to fight for them. As an organizer, people know that they can trust me. They know that when I say, even when they disagree, as I said, I've disagreed with the building trades, OLCV, the Democratic Party. I've had to take a lot of oppositional stances with some of my closest colleagues, and yet they have endorsed me because they know that I will at least tell them the truth and that I will explain my positions. And as an organizer, you depend on those relationships to be an effective governor, to be an effective coalition organizer. And once you've taken away that trust, it's hard to build back. So I think voters want to have somebody who's a proven coalition builder, who can build relationships across the state and has the trust of the communities they've been working with.
Great, thanks very much for your time and joining us today, and thank you too for your questionnaires that you returned. We'll be evaluating that and coming to our decision probably first part of May. But yeah, thanks very much. It was great having this conversation.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.